The next person is Rev Laurence Hillel. He's a co-director of the London Interfaith Centre. He's also an assistant priest at the St Anne's, Brunsbury, and Willows area interfaith advisor for the Church of England.
Good afternoon, everyone, and may I say it's a real great honour to be in the presence of such great scientists, given that I'm not a scientist. One of the reasons why you've got a Christian speaker who's not a scientist here today at a conference on science and religion is because today is Low Sunday, and Low Sunday is because Easter is the most busy part of the year for Christian clergy. Most major clergy or parish clergy will actually be on holiday this week. They take, just to mention that. So I was asked to come and speak on this theme, and I feel slightly embarrassed in the presence of our scientists to be speaking, because my background is basically history and social science, as well as theology. So I'm going to take that approach. And that's why I'm going to actually focus in on the passage which the rabbi mentioned, the first Genesis 1, which tells the story of God's creation of the earth in 6 days, and which, as you will be, as already one speaker in the audience has mentioned, quite a large number of Christians, especially in America, will take as literally true. I want to say that's not my approach. But why would I start with this passage? Well, because and I just want to say that this is a passage not just from the Christian Bible, the very beginning of the Christian Bible. Of course, it is part of the Jewish Torah. We share the same scriptures, and in fact, the first 5 books of the Christian Bible are the same. Is the Jewish Torah. So why do I want to start here? Firstly, because as a person brought up in a religious tradition, I will naturally look at the sacred texts of my tradition to guide me in how I should seek God, behave in this world, and do the very things which I believe is part of the purpose God has created me for. And that's what we're thinking about today. Of course, I've already made assumptions which some would say are non-scientific, namely that I've been created by God, 1, and also that I have been made for a purpose, 2. But scientific thinking wants to describe what it can empirically observe and measure. Talking God language is not de facto the purpose of science, because it's regarded by some as speculative. But as one speaker has already hinted, we probably need to put in some cautionary warnings here. What scientific theory proposes as fact is often theory. Philosophical theory, I think, is a good way of putting it, even though it may be reasonable theory and based on what the evidence appears to support. And indeed, that is particularly so, I would suggest, with regards to theories about the origins of the universe. It's very complicated maths, which I don't pretend to understand, but find absolutely fascinating. Secondly, of course, this text provides the most well-known account of creation amongst Christians. There are, in fact, 2 accounts, as the rabbi pointed out in the book of Genesis, of creation. And the passage we will look at, although the first in the book of Genesis, is in fact probably in a more recent account. And of course, the passage describes the creation of the universe over 6 days. On the 7th day, God rested. And for some Christians who read the Bible literally as the revealed word of God, this is a description of how scientifically the world was created. And there are various different ways in which creationists make sense of the 6 days, but I don't intend to go into that here. You can look up Wikipedia if you want, and you'll find a long article on it. I was looking at it this morning. It's the first time I've actually read something in detail about that approach. But what this passage does is raise the issue directly of what the relationship between religion and science is, which is our topic today. If I take the passage literally, or even as bearing a grain of scientific truth about the process of how the world was created, then I'd already be placing myself on a collision path with the majority of those trained in the discipline of science who accept the theories of evolution and the Big Bang. This is not the position I wish to argue for. My own thinking is that this is not in any way this passage is not in any way an attempt to describe scientifically how the world was created, but rather its content focuses on God's relationship with the physical world we know, and by implication reflects on human purpose and humanity's relationship with both God and the world about us. As a believing Christian, I believe that the scientific method in its pursuit of the truth reflects our human purpose. We are made, as we'll see, in the image of God. And that means that our ability to think, reflect, and understand, and in this I agree with Jay, consciousness in a sense, our ability to think, reflect, and understand are part of how we've been created. Very interestingly, the second description of creation in Genesis chapter 3, which may in fact be the older account, has a scientific form in that it speaks of human beings, man actually, naming each living creature. And herein, you could argue, lies the origin of scientific classification. The discoveries of science are not just, as a believer, revealing to me the complexity and wonder of the natural order and of the potential for creativity and of bettering the lot of humankind, but also increasingly enabling human beings to become co-partners in the act of creation. And that might be a kind of slightly controversial one theologically, but there is a theological approach which says that we have been given the purpose, created in a sense, to be creators like God, in the image of God. However, another word of warning, for as we are discovering in the 21st century, through the use of complex weaponry in war and the use of computer technology to manipulate and deceive, these discoveries have the potential to do harm as well as good, and to lead us metaphorically towards the devil. Before I talk in detail about what I understand the meaning of the passage is, I also want to say that my reading of the text is not just influenced by how my tradition, the church, has interpreted this text over the centuries, but it's also influenced by my desire to understand the purpose of the passage within its context and setting. In other words, I'm bringing my critical faculties to bear on the passage, using the fruits of all the academic biblical scholarship post-Enlightenment, which brings historical, literary, and social scientific methods to help analyze the text. That said, I read the text as a believing Christian, and I trust that in reading this text, I'm not just dealing with it in a rational or scientific manner, but I'm reading the text in the belief that the Holy Spirit will speak to me through it. And that actually, can I say, is something that's slightly different. Often biblical those who are involved in biblical criticism are actually not necessarily believers. So they will go to the text and analyze it historically or in a literary sense and so on. That they're not approaching the text with a sense that God is speaking to them through it. Whereas I will go to that text still having those methods, but actually believe that God is speaking to me in a way through that text. I read it as a believer. So, for example, and this is where I would accept the kind of biblical analysis, I would suggest that the passage is written for a liturgical purpose. Now, you'll notice that it opens and it goes through the 6 days very carefully, and you'll find that there's a kind of repetitive pattern to it. And it sounds most impressively when it's read aloud. So I actually believe that this passage was created to be read aloud, and in a way is in a sense, if used in worship, brings out the relationship of creation and humanity with God. In its reading, it creates a sense of order and a sense of awe and wonder. This passage was used last week on the night of the Easter Vigil, when Christians celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And Christians see that as a sort of act of new creation. So we read the text from Genesis 1 of creation. And it as part of the text, which actually, of several texts, which lead up to the story of the resurrection. And as you listen to it, if you listen to it read out in full length, it does, you get this real sense of the wonder of creation, which I think scientists also discover when they're actually exploring the theories of what makes life and what makes matter and so on. Biblical scholars believe the passage was written sometime in the 6th century before the Common Era, in the exilic period era, and contextually addressing a community's distress that their political and religious world had been undermined by foreign or Babylonian invasion. So there's a kind of real emphasis in this passage on order. And what it's saying in that context is that God remains committed to his people and that the community's well-being is at the heart of God's purpose. But the most important thing for me to understand about this passage in the context of our theme today is that this passage is telling me something poetically, and I think that's the key thing, poetically, and I wouldn't use the word myth. I kind of think there's a problem with the word myth. Because that implies it's completely human created and doesn't have that sense of the spiritual in it. So I would tend to use poetic language because I think that which science doesn't use. So I think there is a difference. I think it's poetic language, and it's talking poetically about human purpose. It's not speaking scientific language or attempting in any way to describe how the world was created. But what it has to say about human purpose has, I think, a bearing on how we treat science and scientific discovery. The emphasis of the whole passage is that God has created this world. You can see, I've highlighted. Now, interestingly, I've just begun, this is the opening bit, and I've given you two different translations. And you'll see there how the translation makes a difference in meaning, which is quite an interesting thing. Because the first one, which is from the Bible the translation I tend to most use in worship, it says, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, and while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters." And it's almost like describing the act of creation not as God creating out of nothing to something, but it's saying when it's almost like this process of creation. It's describing the process of creation. Whereas the second translation, if you look further down, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Very definitely, out of nothing. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. So there's a slight difference in translation, which can make a difference in interpretation. But, okay, so where you've got the wind blowing over the water, that is God. That's that sense of God. And God says, "Let there be light." He speaks. God speaks. And in a way, through his act of speaking, he allows creation to unfold. It's a lovely sense of creation happening. It's not a scientific fact, it's a living statement of belief. God is allowing this to happen. And the text proclaims that there's a relationship between the creator and the created. The world is created, it is separate from God, but it belongs to God. The ultimate meaning of creation is to be found in the heart and purpose of the Creator. All of creation has a purpose. So you've got the creation first of light and darkness. And you'll notice also the emphasis right through on the emphasis on creation being good. God saw that the light was good. And then God creates the dome. Again, I would not take this literally. And it's a medieval, the medieval world believed that there was a dome. You see the images of this and so on. But it's not science. It was just the image. It's a way of describing the world at that time, in that context. There's no way that people who wrote this, say, 2,500 years ago, could have the scientific knowledge that we have. And so to actually think it's saying that is ridiculous, it seems to me. But so you've got this order. So now you've got sky, and you've got, and there was the evening, there was the morning, the second day. So you've got this sense of order, and then you get the creation of earth and seas, plant, fruit, and vegetation. So you've got the sense of order again. And God saw that it was good towards the end. And there was evening, there was morning, the third day. I'm rushing through. And then you've got the creation of the lights, the moon and the stars, and so on. So there's a real sense of order here. Then the creation of the birds and the sea creatures, the fifth day. And then the animals. Again, that emphasis on God seeing that all is good. And I'll comment on this in a moment, and then we get to humankind. Now, all of creation has a purpose. That purpose may in particular be identified in the section dealing with the creation of human beings. God does not make mechanistically. He enters a relationship with his creation. He allows things to be. He calls, he invites. He thus says, let there be light, and there was light. He's not detached from what he creates. He loves what he creates, and he calls his creation to himself. He invites human beings, as the rabbi said, into a covenantal relationship, not tyrannically, but freely. Keith Ward, a Christian theologian, has written many books on the relationship of religion and science, and he points out that science and belief in God share a common understanding that all things have an explanation, a cause. Things don't happen chaotically. The theological and scientific purpose is to explain that cause. Where science and religion might, but do not have to, part is in identifying the cause which gives living beings their purpose. Some scientists might argue that either by chance or by intrinsic necessity things came into being, but the religious believer, while accepting all that science has to offer on the origins of the universe and life, still wants to say that the purpose and motivation comes from God. The implication of this is that the world belongs to God, not to myself. I simply cannot exploit it for my purposes. Human beings have been created in God's image. It says there, so God created humankind let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness. So humans have been created in God's image, but they are subject to God's command. They themselves are part of the created order, created like other living beings with a purpose. That purpose is defined by God. In other words, we have a duty to respect God's creation. Human beings are called to be fruitful and multiply and fill and subdue the earth and to act on behalf of God, having dominion over all creatures. They are invited to live in the image of God, perhaps as fellow creators. Now, how do we understand this? And I might slightly part from the rabbi here. And this is about the only bit of the rabbi that I've loved your talk, may I say. To subdue the earth, it talks about be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And to subdue the earth implies creating order out of chaos, bringing it under control, but in a positive sense. So that actually it enables things to be made or create or grow or whatever. So it's like I have an allotment, so I might talk about tilling the earth and tilling the rough earth to land to enable it to produce crops. And then dominion, and I accept that it's traditionally been accepted as associated with power, but it does carry the meaning of rule because it comes from domus. But rule implies ruling like God. And if you rule like God, you have to follow in what you act like God, which implies service. And in a sense, a Christian would say, how do we understand that rule? Well, you understand that through the model of Jesus Christ. Because obviously a Christian would follow that. So Jesus emphasizes service and seeking the welfare of all creatures. So the dominion is not about abuse or exploitation, it's about service. God delights in his creation. God saw that it was good. But God does not just delight in human beings. He delights in all of creation, in its variety and abundance. He doesn't just say that human beings are good. He says all of creation is good. And that is important because it reminds us that the world and the universe was created for all living beings and not just for human beings. We tend to forget that. We share our world and we need to respect its diversity. And this may have implications regarding how science uses animals, etc., for experiment, and a complex area, and I'm not going to get into that, but I'm just throwing that one out. But it certainly has all sorts of repercussions, re the use of technological and scientific invention in themselves morally in the pursuit of material gain at the expense of the natural world. I mean, too often scientific invention or technological inventions are used to abuse the world or for our exploitation and not for the good of the world. And the point about this passage is it implies there is an order to creation in creation which requires our respect. That order existed before human beings came into being. We need to respect that order. We are not demigods with a godlike ability to recreate the world as we may wish. We are creatures marvelously gifted and extraordinarily competent creatures, but creatures who are subject to moral boundaries. We are called to work with the created order of the world, not against it. So, to finish, though being amazed sometimes by the discovery of science, and I do find it amazing, and by the possibilities which they bring, I have a real sense of awe and wonder when I watch scientific programs. I'm also clear that I see the scientific path as one which has potential to do harm as well as good, unless it exists within a moral compass. And the difficulty, I think, is working out what those boundaries are. And I think that's an issue we perhaps haven't touched on. What restrictions, if any, do we place on the freedom to experiment? So, for example, scientific thought is exciting because in its theorizing, it goes into areas which seem to be apparently impossible to the known world. Think of the advances in food production and the consequences for human health, which quite rightly would not have discovered without scientific research. But on the other hand, we would all accept that experiments which cause pain are unacceptable. Science can abuse, and I think that's an issue that we need to kind of reflect on. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.